Today I'd like to talk about some of the traumatic experiences which we go through in life. Are they just disasters, or could they possibly be essential to help us reach our destiny? But first of all, let me tell you a little story. There was once a wealthy lord who owned a very large piece of land. As this man looked out over the beautiful meadows, watching the rabbits hopping through the luscious grass, bees and butterflies flitting amongst the buttercups and daisies, and admiring the birds and squirrels playing in vast trees, he had a vision. A vision of a magnificent estate comprising a mansion which housed stables and garages, set in acres of cultivated gardens filled with orchards, exotic trees and plants, rock gardens, brooks and bridges. He began to sketch his vision and showed them to an architect and landscape gardener who made blueprints to enable his vision to become a reality. Once the Lord had agreed their plans, he contacted surveyors and builders who named their price and gave dates when they could commence the work he'd commissioned them to do. At last, the day dawned when the work would begin. The Lord arrived on the scene late in the day to find heavy machinery and equipment already installed and operative, and the ground swarming with men hard at work. In only a few hours, they'd completely devastated the former peace and tranquility of his land. All wildlife had gone. They'd fled in fear as the bulldozers had ripped through the fields, digging up all the grass and flowers and tearing out the trees. The place was a mess. These workmen seemed bent on destruction and didn't care in the slightest for anything which he had once considered beautiful in its natural state. Day after day, the land became more ravaged. Instead of dew and rain-filled grassland, the ground was a muddy bog stripped of colour. Had the Lord made a costly mistake? Could anything good come out of this devastation? Of course. With time, things changed. After the tearing down came the building up. The work was intense and thorough, but after months of hard labour, the workforce produced the desired result, and the Lord was well satisfied. The wildlife returned to the area to enjoy more pleasures than they had ever experienced before, as there were now streams and ponds to splash about in. The Lord was able to live in the mansion and enjoy his dream. Yes, it was well worth all his effort. It doesn't matter what area in life you're trying to make your mark, whether it's show business, athletics, in fact, in any field at all. If you want to become successful, you have to pay your dues. There are no shortcuts. I find it heartbreaking to read the story of Joseph in the Bible. His crime was that he was the longed-for son of his father's favourite wife. Although Jacob had wives, Rachel was his true love. For 14 long years he'd worked for her father Laban, who was the most cunning, greedy man he'd ever had the misfortune to know, so that he could purchase the right to marry this woman. Yet when she finally became his, 14 years hard labour seemed as nothing, because his love for Rachel was so great. But Rachel watched in agony as her older sister Leah, who was also Jacob's wife, produced 6 sons for Jacob, while she herself was barren. Years later, God finally blessed her, and she gave Jacob Joseph. Jacob didn't hide his feelings for this long-awaited son. He couldn't help loving this child because he came from his beloved Rachel. You'd think that Jacob's 10 other sons would have doted on this little boy, who was the son of his old age and the baby of the family. But they were peevish and hated the fact that their father showed Joseph such favour. The Bible records that the problem the Pharisees had with Jesus was envy. They couldn't stand the fact that he was more popular than they were, so they plotted to have him crucified. And these 10 brothers envied Joseph so much that they too wanted to kill him, and would have done so whilst out on the hills tending their father's sheep if traders hadn't been passing by. They reasoned that to kill him, they wouldn't have had any material gain, so decided to sell him as a slave for 20 pieces of silver, and watched without an ounce of pity as he was dragged away from them, screaming for mercy. They were completely deaf to Joseph's cries. I think you have to experience rejection by your family firsthand to ever appreciate the pain that Joseph went through. There's nothing so crushing as this type of persecution. Yet Joseph was God-fearing and blessed with a godly disposition. No matter where he went or who he worked for, he was singled out as a skilled, hard worker who got results. He earned the trust and respect of Potiphar, his first employer, who was an Egyptian ruler and was put in charge of all his estate. Joseph was in a tremendous position of authority, yet didn't get conceited or allow his climb up the ladder to go to his head. When Potiphar's wife tried to proposition him, he made it very plain to her that she was the only thing he was not allowed to touch, and he would not abuse the trust of his employer, which had been placed in him. Potiphar's wife, on the other hand, was furious when she experienced his rejection. The ardent desire she'd previously had for him turned swiftly to anger, then to hatred. In fact, she hated him so much that she declared he'd raped her, and his boss had him flung into prison. You know, Joseph must have searched his soul day and night, wondering what he'd done to offend God. Why was it that no matter how hard he tried to honour God and serve those in authority over him, people always ended up both misinterpreting and misrepresenting him? And why was it people were so extreme in the way they dealt with him? They weren't content to just hurt or punish him. They wanted to completely annihilate him. Why? Joseph must have been so utterly lonely, away from family, away from friends, thrown into prison for something he hadn't done. How low can you go? How crushed can you be? But God was still working in his life. This was all part of the process. God couldn't achieve the vision he had for Joseph without putting him through all this crushing. The pain was actually making Joseph the person God had intended him to become. Here was a man utterly abandoned, with no friends, yet even here, the keeper of the prison recognised God's favour upon him and put him in charge of all the other prisoners. He didn't concern himself with anything Joseph did, because the Lord was with Joseph. Joseph must have felt completely alone and forgotten. What a shock when he was bathed and clothed and brought before Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the then known world. God gave Joseph the interpretation of a dream which had troubled Pharaoh. And in a matter of a few minutes, his station in life changed from prisoner to prime minister. This is one of the most amazing stories in the Bible. God elevated this Hebrew, this nobody, so highly that he was actually running the whole country for Pharaoh. And not only that, under his direction, he made the Pharaoh the most wealthy man on the planet, using the famine to buy land, livestock, and people in exchange for grain. But notice Joseph's attitude when faced with his brothers. He could have done so much damage to them. Next to the Pharaoh, Joseph was the most powerful man in the whole of Egypt. He could have completely destroyed his enemies. But God had done such a work in Joseph that he couldn't hold grudges. Although it had not yet been written, he could have quoted the scripture, "All things work together for good for those who love God, the called according to his purpose." In fact, he even said to his brothers, "You meant it for harm, but God meant it for good," because Joseph had not fought or resisted against the pressure. God had been able to perfect him so that not only his family had been saved from certain death, but the whole of Egypt and many other nations round about. The Bible's full of stories showing how people experienced devastating trials only to find themselves in glorious situations later on in life because they allowed God to dig up all their old sinful nature and make a brand new man out of them, fashioned like unto his precious and obedient Son, Jesus the Christ. We must always remember that God is the master potter, and we're just lumps of clay which need to be moulded, shaped, fired and glazed. Stay on the wheel and allow the Lord to stretch and pull and pummel. He knows what he's doing. Our problem is that we've not seen the blueprint, nor have we had the vision of what our lives were destined to become. Only God knows that. But I'm absolutely certain that if we allow God to have his perfect way in our lives without complaint or resistance, God won't be the only one pleased with the result. I'm sure that we'll be delighted also with what we can become in this life by God's grace. So God bless you.